Chicago just recorded its deadliest weekend of the year with 66 shot and 12 killed in just a 63-hour period, including a boy riding his bike and a 14-year-old and two 17-year-old girls just standing on the sidewalk.
We have a heavy heart. Our souls are burdened. What happened this weekend did not happen in every neighborhood in Chicago, but it is unacceptable to happen in any neighborhood of Chicago.
Well, so far this year, 1,785 have been shot in Chicago and 318 killed. Now, believe it or not, shootings are actually down 30% from 2017, and murders are down 25%, but still those figures are well above what Chicago experienced earlier in the decade. In 2011, when Democratic Mayor Rahm Emanuel was elected, there were 436 murders in Chicago. By 2016, that number had ballooned to 771, a 77% increase. And while 2017 was down from that high water mark, it still saw a devastating 650 slayings. Now, as you might imagine, there's enormous political pressure now on Emanuel to offer solutions to this heartbreaking cycle. It's about time. With that election just months away, he responded today sounding more like Tom Sowell than an Obama liberal.
You can talk about the weather, but the weather didn't pull the trigger. And you can talk about jobs, and they count. But in parts of the city where there aren't jobs, people did not pull a trigger. There are too many guns on the street, too many people with criminal records on the street, and there is a shortage of values about what is right, what is wrong, what is acceptable, what is condoned, and what is condemned.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but on that, he's right. Of course, policing and economic opportunity matter. They matter quite a bit. But are those the factors that are definitive? Of course not. In 2017, the victims of homicide in Chicago were 76% African American, and a disproportionate number of the assailants arrested were also black, primarily male. So what's the cause? Well, if you ask a leftist or the intellectuals who dominate our universities, they'll blame crime on institutional racism or maybe poverty. But as economist Tom Sowell wrote just a few years ago after the Ferguson riots, you cannot take any people of any color and exempt them from the requirements of civilization without ruinous consequences to them and to society at large. Murder rates among black males were going down, repeat, down, during much of the much-lamented 1950s, while it went up after the much-celebrated 1960s, reaching levels more than double what they had been before. Most black children were raised in two-parent families prior to the 1960s, but today, the great majority of black children are raised in one-parent families. Now, to put it a little bit more specifically, in 1950, 17% of black children lived in single-parent households. At that point, black labor participation rate exceeded that of whites. But today, 70% of black children live in one-parent households, and that number is pretty much reversed. Now, moms do their best, of course, and they're heroic. But especially in dangerous areas, boys without fathers or male role models often get hooked in with really bad people. Remember this video from Baltimore, a mother urging her child very aggressively during the Freddie Gray riots. That's actually a mother's love. I mean, maybe she used some four-letter words, but she could have saved his life that day. And remember Barack Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative. It was launched in 2014, and it started out as a way to assist at-risk boys, mostly of color. In the first year, he raised $300 million in corporate donations to help get young men jobs through mentoring and other work fairs, work projects. No real measure yet of the program's real impact, But to the extent that it stresses hard work and personal responsibility, I think it's great.
I stopped being nonchalant. I started caring about my grades and the difference between an A and a B. I started demanding more out of myself. I know excellence is possible, and I need to strive for that.
Too often, however, the social justice warriors fall into the grievance trap of excusing rather than punishing what ends up being criminal behavior. Now, remember the looting and the violence that we saw in Ferguson and Baltimore a few years ago during what were supposed to be protests about the deaths of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray? Well, President Obama used a My Brother's Keeper event to provide context, almost to explain away the violence.
Some communities have consistently had the odds stacked against them. That there's a tragic history in this country that has made it tougher for some. That sense of unfairness and of powerlessness, that's helped fuel some of the protests that we've seen in places like Baltimore and Ferguson. In too many places in this country, black boys and black men, Latino boys, Latino men, they experience being treated differently by law enforcement.
Well, I'm sure a lot of them do. But at some point, this becomes race baiting. And the king of this is Al Sharpton. Remember his contribution to stemming the violence in Chicago? His contribution was renting an apartment in the city for some period of time in 2013.
In September, we, Martin Luther and I, are going to take an apartment on the west side and stay among the people and walk children to school.
I'm pretty sure after we rented the apartment, things got worse, but I'm surprised that didn't do the trick. Great idea, Al. Look, I don't doubt that young people living in the Englewood or the West Garfield Park neighborhoods of Chicago can feel really hopeless and even distrustful against the police. But the real problem isn't aggressive policing. The real problem are gangs with memberships that have become generational. Young boys without fathers or any male role models. Anyone who cares about them who's a male are too often sucked into the cults of criminality. Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, who knows a thing or two about cleaning up a city, thinks it's time to show the man they once called Rombo the door, tweeting, "Chicago murders are a direct result of one-party Democratic rule for decades. Policing genius, he meant Gary McCarthy, can do for Chicago what I did for New York City. He was one of the architects of CompStat. It slashed homicide over 70%, tens of thousands of lives saved." Well, it's true that citizens most affected seem to be growing very weary of Emanuel's political dance.
Ron Emanuel, first of all, is a con man. His whole job is to keep black folks divided.
No, he doesn't care about anybody but the people in his neighborhood and his family.
Opposition to Mayor Emanuel, Obama's protege, it's been building for many reasons. Part of it, the schools, the crime now, and remember how proud he was about this.
Chicago was a sanctuary city before anybody knew what sanctuary city meant. This ordinance that we are defending in the federal court is consistent with that value system. It not only gives honor and import to our past, it actually shines a bright light to the future that we have together as a city.
Well, that's not going over so well on the South Side.
He cares more about non-citizens, African Americans. We're citizens, and our ancestors built this country.
He got some good things, but I think he don't step up and come to the people where the crime is. You know what I'm saying? The crime is on the South Side and the West Side.
And there's the abysmally low percentage of murderers brought to justice under his leadership. In 2017, the police solved only 114 of the 650 murders that occurred in the same year. That's 17.5% only. In the early 1990s, that figure was 60%. No wonder people on the South Side are frustrated. So many have promised to try to help Chicago, but few have delivered solutions. Maybe because hard truths are uncomfortable. It may be because sometimes they're not politically correct. Now, I've been saying since the campaign of 2016 that we need to see more bold-thinking conservatives in the inner cities of this country. The risk is not in showing up. The risk is in not showing up. Solutions, not politics, are what is needed.
I have to make sure that President Trump recognized that not everyone believes that Chicago is a Trump-free zone. If he's serious about helping the people in Chicago, especially on the west side of Chicago, I accept his help. We can't turn any help away. We have to make sure that people understand that criminals cannot have their way with our streets. If Chicago Police Department and all the other law enforcement can't do it, we should seek other help.
Every day, radicals claim that President Trump is racist. Now, as someone who's known him for, 15 years or so, I can tell you that is 100% false. And it's a slanderous and defamatory charge meant to deflect attention from liberals' own abject failures in leading urban America. Trump's booming economy is benefiting African Americans and Latinos and all Americans who wish to better themselves. The one thing we do know, racial hucksters do not have the answers to prevent another weekend just like we saw in Chicago. And that's the angle.